They told me the last keeper left without a word. One morning, a passing ferry saw the light had gone dark, and when they sent someone up from the mainland, they found the place empty. The locks were still open on the desk, the teacup half full beside it. Nothing broken, nothing burned. He was just gone. I arrived 2 weeks later, under a grey sky and a bitter wind that blew sideways off the sea. The boat that brought me didn't linger. The man at the tiller gave me a nod and a glance that lasted a moment too long. Then he turned his vessel and slid back into the fog. I watched until even the wake had vanished, then looked up at the tower. It rose from the cliff like the spine of some long-dead beast, tall and pale and weather-stained, with rust seeping from its seams. Behind it stretched the keeper's cottage. It was stone-walled and roofed in weathered slate. A gull cried somewhere overhead, and the wind smelled like salt and iron. I unlocked the door with a key mailed weeks ago in a yellow envelope. The latch stuck until I put my shoulder into it, and the door gave way with a groan, like something being disturbed. The inside was dim and quiet. Dust floated in narrow beams of light, and everything was in order, at least more or less. The desk stood where it should, facing the window. The shelves were stocked with old manuals, lantern oil, and tools. A narrow bed leaned against the wall. It was made. I felt like someone had stripped the room of personality. The only thing left behind was a faded photograph, slipped under the blotter. A group of men standing outside the tower, staring into the camera. None of them smiled. I put my bag down and started the routine. That's what they tell you. Start the routine right away. The isolation's manageable if the hours have shape. Morning inspection, midday lens cleaning, night watch, and beacon maintenance. I started by walking the tower, touching cold railings, climbing the steps one by one, listening to the echo of my boots spiral upward. The higher I climbed, the more the wind found its voice, whispering through cracks and corners. And at the top, the lens waited. It was a beautiful thing, brass-rimmed and many-faceted, wrapped around the great eye of the beacon like a crown. The mechanism itself was intact. The flame would burn, so I lit it that night with a sense of ceremony, watching as it pulsed to life, casting long sweeping arcs across the sea. It turned in silence, and the room grew warm. The ocean beyond it remained still. There were no ships and no buoys, nothing but endless black. The days blurred, as they always do in places like this. Morning bled into dusk, dusk into dreams. I walked the grounds, climbed the cliffs, stood in the lens chamber and listened to the fire hum. I ate my meals in silence, wrote in the logbook, and did not speak aloud. Not once. There was no one to hear me. But slowly, a sense of familiarity settled over me. Not just with the place, but with the silence. It was not a lonely silence. It felt occupied, as though the walls had memory, as though the wind carried whispers not meant for me, but simply passing through. At night, I began to notice things. A faint scrape on the floorboards, as though a chair had shifted without cause. A draft that touched my neck, though no windows were open. And once, I even found the kettle warm in the morning, though I hadn't lit the stove. I told myself it was imagination, ritual-thinned nerves, the mind rebelling against monotony. But the feeling persisted. There was something beneath the quiet. And one evening, as the sun dipped behind the clouds and the sea swallowed its light, I took my lantern and wandered. The tower loomed behind me, its beam turning slowly, slicing the mist. I walked the edge of the cliff, boots crunching against gravel, listening to the waves below. They didn't crash as they should have. They just lapped, gentle, rhythmic and patient. It felt less like the sea was reaching and more like it was waiting. I turned back and saw the tower again, its silhouette sharp against the darkening sky. The beam swung past, lighting the ground for a breath of a moment. And in that moment, I saw something near the base of the tower I hadn't seen before. An outline in the earth. A square, faintly traced, covered in moss and gravel. I returned with tools the next day and uncovered the trapdoor. It was old, made of heavy wood, reinforced with iron straps. The hinges were rusted nearly shut, and I had to use the crowbar to lift it. A slow groan filled the air as it opened, long and strained, like the tower itself was reluctant to give up its secret. And beneath the trapdoor, stairs spiraled into shadow. Damp air spilled upward, not foul, but kind of wrong, still like a breath held for too long. I stood over it for a long time, lantern in hand, listening. Then I closed the door, placed the crowbar beside it, and returned inside the tower. That night, I dreamed of waves retreating, not receding with tide, but pulled away by unseen force, revealing not sand or stone beneath, but something else. Stone, yes, but carved, rising, waiting. When I woke, I found myself already dressed, standing by the window, staring out to sea. The lens above still turned, and the light still burned, but I felt deep in the base of the tower, inside the walls, inside my spine, that something beneath had begun to stir. I didn't descend the hidden stairs right away. I would pass the trapdoor often, more often than necessary, if I'm honest, each time glancing at it as though it might open on its own. There was something about it, something that tugged at the edge of my thoughts, like a dream I couldn't quite remember. It didn't feel like a discovery. It felt like a memory resurfacing, as though the door had always been there, and I had only just remembered to look. Eventually, I stopped resisting, On a night when the wind died and the sea went still, I lit the lantern and pulled open the trapdoor. The hinges groaned in protest. The air that rose to me was not cold, not in the way stone cellars or forgotten basements are cold. It was warmer, thicker, damp with something that had no scent, only weight. The darkness below was dense, nearly tangible. I stood for a long time, staring into it, until I realized I wasn't afraid. I was calm, curious, like I was returning to a room I had once known. The stairs spiraled tightly, carved from the rock itself. I descended slowly, brushing the damp wall with one hand to steady myself. I tried to count the steps, but lost track early on. They repeated in a quiet rhythm, as though I were pacing out something ancient buried beneath the stone. The deeper I went, the more the lighthouse above began to feel unreal, distant, like a place I had only read about. When the stairs ended, I stepped into a wide chamber carved into the bedrock, and my lantern struggled against the dark. The space was neither natural nor recent. Though the stone was rough and uneven, the chamber bore marks of design, intentionality. Strange lines were carved along the curved walls, loops and circles that seemed to spiral toward a vanishing point behind the stone itself. In the center stood the basin. At first, I thought it was dry, but as I stepped closer, I saw the liquid within. Thick, black, and perfectly still. It didn't reflect my light. It didn't reflect anything at all. Around the basin, I noticed symbols carved into the floor, repeated images of an eye, a spiral, and a wave, etched again and again with small obsessive strokes. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear exactly, but a sense that I was being drawn into something far older than I could comprehend. The basin wasn't meant to be used. It was meant to be seen, or remembered. Along the far wall, half buried beneath a pile of crumbled stone, I found a journal bound in hide. The pages were damp, but the ink remained barely legible, written in an archaic hand that suggested multiple authors over many years. Some of it was written in languages I couldn't place, but others had been annotated, translated. There were references to the lighthouse, to flame, to a watcher beneath. One passage had been circled many times, the ink bleeding through the page. The sea was not made to cover it. The sea was made to keep us away. As I read further, a kind of quiet dread crept in. Not the kind that strikes you all at once, but something deeper. The kind that seeps into your bones and rearranges what you think of as truth. The journal didn't describe a creature in a way we think of them. Not with body or voice or hunger. It spoke of a presence, a weight beneath the world, something that had once slept in lightless depths before the ocean itself was formed to bury it. There were no names, only symbols. Always the spiral, the eye, and the wave. The watcher did not move. It did not speak, but it listened, and it remembered. The final entry had been scrawled hastily, half a sentence fading into illegibility. It dreams in the rhythm of the beacon. The flame must never. The rest was lost to mold and time. I sat there in the dark, listening to the silence. And I realized then that the light above, the great rotating beacon, was not meant to protect. It wasn't a warning. It was a signal, not to sailors, but to whatever lay beneath. Or perhaps it was even older than that. Perhaps the flame burned simply because it always had. Because to stop it would be to break something we no longer understood. In the days that followed, I returned to the chamber often. I didn't always go down the stairs. Sometimes I just stood at the trapdoor, listening. The walls of the lighthouse began to feel thinner, more brittle. I started to hear things in the stone. Whispering. No, more like breathing. It was deep and slow, like the tides. I would sit at my desk, journal open before me, and feel the tower pulse ever so slightly beneath my feet. As if the island was not anchored to the ocean floor, but floating on something alive. Then came the dreams. They weren't violent or even particularly frightening, just persistent. In them, I stood on the sea floor. The water pulled away as if by divine force. And all around me, colossal shapes rose from the mud. Pillars, archways, impossible machines. And at the center of it all, not a being, not a presence, something that bent the world around it, something that hadn't moved in eons, but would if it chose. In those dreams, I wasn't afraid, I was reverent. I began to forget what the Lightkeeper's duties had once meant to me. The logbook went untouched, the maintenance schedule blurred. I couldn't even remember what day it was, or how many ships had passed. I would stand in the lens room and stare at the turning flame for hours, hearing nothing but the slow hum of the glass, watching as it swept across the sea, like a blind eye searching for memory. One night, as I watched, I felt it again, the hum, but deeper. Not from the gears, not from the flame, but from below. It rose through the foundation of the tower, through the very stone, resonating in the walls. The sea outside was perfectly calm, and yet it felt like the ocean itself was listening. The dream that night was different. I saw the island, not as it is, but as it once was. Bare rock, no lighthouse, no ships, just a circle of standing stones, and a fire at their center. Figures stood around it, heads bowed, eyes closed. They chanted something low and rhythmic, and then, without sound, The sea rose, not from beyond the horizon, but from within the earth, swallowing the circle whole. It wasn't drowning them, it was covering the mouth. I woke before dawn, heart silent. I did not light the beacon that morning, and still it turned. And when the sun rose, it felt wrong, too bright, too loud, as though it was trespassing. And I think the lighthouse no longer needs me. Or perhaps it never did. Perhaps all this time I have only been watched, and the watcher is waking. The days no longer feel distinct. The schedule I once clung to like a lifeline has withered into habit, and even that has begun to decay. The logbook lies untouched. I cannot recall the last time I wrote in it. Each morning, I find myself already at the top of the tower, watching the beam pass through the mist like a pendulum. The flame no longer needs tending. It simply is, eternal, unwavering, burning with a steadiness that feels less like fuel and more like will. I don't even remember lighting it anymore. I have grown quieter too. At first, I used to speak aloud, to myself, to the empty room, to the gulls. Now I find my voice foreign. My thoughts seem to rise from elsewhere, not formed but received. They arrive fully shaped, as if whispered by a mouth close behind me. And though I hear nothing, I know deeply that I am no longer alone in this place. The door to the stairwell below the trapdoor remains unlocked now. I don't know when I stopped closing it. I visit the chamber often, though I never descend fully. I stand at its edge and peer into the dark where the basin waits. The black liquid never ripples, never reflects, but I feel it watching. Not me specifically, just watching, as though it remembers what eyes are supposed to do. More pages of the journal have flaked away with time, but I have gleaned enough. The lighthouse was never a warning. It was an anchor, a signal post, a relic not of guidance, but of restraint. A wound in the world, stitched shut by ritual and repetition. They build it above the chamber, not to light the way for ships, but to lull the thing below into slumber. The beam was its rhythm, the flame its tether. And now I fear that rhythm has changed. It began slowly. The beam started to linger just a second longer each pass. The gearwork, once so precise, hums with a note just slightly off. It's like hearing a heartbeat stutter, barely noticeable, but unmistakably wrong. I try to adjust the mechanism, but every time I open the casing, every time it appears in order, and still the change persists. Then the birds stopped coming. There were always gulls, always cormorants nesting in the cliffs, always something alive, clinging to the edge of the sea. But now, nothing. Not a call, not a shadow, not a wing in the air. Even the wind has grown still. Some nights I open the window just to confirm the silence isn't imagined. And every time I am met with stillness so deep it seems to press inward, like the sky itself is holding its breath. Last night I dreamt of the sea again, but it was no longer calm. It was gone, pulled back to a jagged horizon, revealing a scarred seabed littered with stone and bone. At its center, something vast had begun to rise. Not quickly, not violently. It emerged like memory, slow and certain, ancient and inevitable. Not a creature, not a god, but a concept given weight, a void shaped into form. There were no eyes, no limbs, only mass and intent. I stood on the cliffs, not as I am now, but as I was before I was born. I understood then that the flame above was not just light. It was a lock, and now it flickers. This morning, I found a stone beside my bed, wet, covered in moss, the same kind I pried away from the trapdoor. I hadn't brought it there, and when I placed it outside, I found another waiting at the door when I returned. I don't know if it's a warning, a message, or an invitation. Perhaps it doesn't matter. I no longer feel the urge to leave. The mainland is distant, unreachable, not geographically but spiritually. I no longer belong to the rhythms of men. I belong to this place, as every keeper before me did, whether they knew it or not. I wonder how many of them saw what I have seen, how many heard the silence stretch and warp, how many dreamt of the sea pulling back to reveal what should never have been seen. The light still turns, but it slows. Each revolution draws a little more breath from the world. Tonight, I went below again. This time it did not stop at the stairs. The basin is deeper than it appears. When I reached into it, the surface did not resist. My hand disappeared without sensation. No cold, no warmth, only a gentle pull. I withdrew it dry, but in the darkness below, I heard a low groan rise from the stone, as though something ancient was turning in its sleep, or waking. I will go again tomorrow. Perhaps I will step in fully, not out of madness or fear, but because it wants me to. And because the flame above no longer burns for the world above. It burns for the one below. I am the last Lightkeeper, and I was never meant to keep the light. I was meant to keep it company until it was ready to rise.